Lisa Roberts from the Department of Corrections. Rocky Mountain PBS News is at work on a new documentary about the criminal justice system, which we will debut here in May. It's part of our Race in Colorado initiative, and we'll be looking at the racial disparities from arrests to incarceration to reintegration to communities. Some educators believe the road to prison is rooted in inequality in our society that starts as early as preschool. Consider this statistic. The U.S. Department of Education says while African American children make up only 18% of students enrolled in preschool, they account for 42% of all suspensions from school. That's 3 and 4-year-olds being tossed out of school for bad behavior. We know that early childhood period is critical, and we're going to talk about it with 2 education experts. One of them, Dr. Hakim Rashid of Howard University School of Education, has recently debuted a documentary film in which he examines how these preschool suspensions can have a lasting and profound effect, especially on African American boys.
Little boys of African descent grew up to develop and lead some of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. Here in the United States, they have a legacy of leadership, creativity, rebellion, resilience, perseverance, and defying the odds. All of the great black men, as well as those who were abused and murdered, were once little boys who should have all passed through that period from birth through the early childhood years, being nurtured, supported, challenged, and ready to transition into the later childhood years and ultimately into adulthood. The sobering reality is that most African American children will continue to be educated by the American public school system, a system that has proven itself incapable of providing equal educational opportunity for all.
Dr. Hakim Rashid of the Howard University School of Education has written and directed this new documentary titled Strange Fruit Redux: The Perils of Young Black Boys in Early Childhood Education. And also with us is Dr. Rosemarie Allen, Professor of Early Childhood Education at Metro State University here in Denver. Dr. Rashid, in the film you illustrate what the statistics show, that African American children are disproportionately suspended out of preschool, and you say that can lead to a long-lasting disengagement with school. Is that right?
Well, I think historically there's been some discussion about the school-to-prison pipeline, and now we're talking about the preschool-to-prison pipeline. Because if we really look at the way that children bond with the educational system, it happens nowadays in early childhood education when we have so many more children going to preschool centers. And unfortunately, the preschool suspension rate is actually higher than the public school suspension rate.
That was remarkable when I read that statistic. Rosemarie, what kind of behaviors are children being suspended for when they are 3 and 4 years old?
Well, a lot of this is really typical behaviors. My research shows that children are suspended or expelled from school starting at 17 months, usually for biting. And biting is a typical behavior for a 17-month-old. So we see biting, we see what teachers call defiance, we see what they label as aggressive behaviors, but they're engaging in the behaviors that we've seen for years. Kicking, screaming, biting, fighting, tantruming, things like that.
And so aren't these, as you say, they're typical behaviors for that age group? Are teachers not aware and equipped to deal with that?
Well, it depends on the situation. We've got a lot of data out there that shows that typically there's a big disparity in quality between, I guess you would say, high poverty centers and centers in more middle to upper class communities.
So you may not have teachers who are equipped to deal with it in a poverty school.
And a lot of it depends. Many Head Start centers, for example, are doing a good job because they have a lot of teacher training. But if you're just talking about certain community-based kinds of programs where the teachers don't get a chance to get a lot of professional development, you don't have a lot of mental health consultation going on, then that's where you're going to tend to see higher levels of suspension.
And we are, certainly in the film, you're talking about boys specifically, but it happens to African American girls too, and it happened to you, Dr.
Yes, it did. Actually, the studies are showing that African American girls are 12 times more likely than white girls to be suspended. I was one of those girls. I didn't go to preschool, but I started being suspended from school at kindergarten at least 5 to 7 times a year and was actually expelled from 3 schools before I graduated high school.
And this was for what kinds of things?
I was so confused when I was younger. The things that I was praised for at home, being curious and being one who liked to experiment and explore, was praised at home, but I got in trouble at school for things like digging a hole in the playground so I could see where China was on the other end. I took all the baby dolls' heads off once so I could see how the eyes worked. And they all worked differently, so I kept taking the heads off and was pretty much labeled a demon and sent home for that. So
this is something that happens all too often, where teachers just don't want to deal with the behavior, whatever it is, and they bounce the child out?
I think what happens is that, again, there's data to show that quite often black children can do certain things in classrooms, and they'll get punished in a different way than a white child. And a lot of that has to do with the cultural mismatch. Young black boys are seen as maturing earlier, for example. So you might have a young black boy that's 9 years old and he might be seen as 12 or 13. That happened with my own grandson, for example, with a coach.
Is that right?
And so those kinds of things happen on a pretty regular basis.
So what we're talking about here is implicit bias, which we have started to learn more about, certainly here at Rocky Mountain PBS, as we have worked on our series of documentaries about race in Colorado. What is implicit bias?
Implicit bias is an unconscious bias and is triggered automatically. People are not aware they have it, and we all do. And this bias impacts our perceptions and behaviors and the way that we feel and think about other people. In the classroom, we see this play out when children, like Dr. Rashid said, are engaged in the same behaviors, but the child of color, the behavior for some reason is more pronounced, and the child is punished in a different way. All those behaviors we talked about earlier, every child engages in them. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it that children of color, particularly African American boys and girls, are suspended or expelled for those exact same behaviors? I was actually visiting a classroom not long ago, and there was a child, Raphael, with 2 of his white friends at the sand table. They were supposed to sit down. It was circle time, and the teacher kept saying, "Raphael, sit down. Raphael, did you hear this? Raphael, Raphael." And I started to count. They called his name 27 times in 7 minutes. His name, while he was engaged in the same behaviors.
The other 2 weren't sitting down either.
Absolutely.
I see.
So I'm sure the teacher had no idea she was doing that, and that's how implicit bias plays out.
Now, was that a white teacher?
Yes, it was.
So let's talk about the number of teachers, minority teachers. There are not enough of them. Is that right?
That's very true. I think the figures are upwards of 80% of the teachers, particularly at the elementary level, are white females. So you're going to have this cultural disconnect. And this is what is so important about the whole teacher preparation process, and why it's important to get the right research and literature into the hands of those who are engaged in the teacher preparation process.
How do you get more minority college students to want to go this direction and become teachers?
Well, I think the culture devalues teaching, and it's going to be important for young people of color to recognize that they have a role to play in overturning some of these statistics, that they're going to have to begin to choose teaching as a career, but the society itself is going to have to value teaching more. There's a lot that we can do. One of the things we talk about in the film, the whole notion of community-based organizations, tutorial programs. There's just a lot that needs to be done above and beyond the classroom.
You, Rosemarie, overcame those early years, obviously, and became enough interested in education to become a teacher yourself. What was the reason for that? Was that your family?
It was my family. I had a very, very supportive family, and no matter what happened at school, they still affirmed who I was at home. They told me I wasn't a bad child. They told me that I was good and I was smart and I was capable. And one of the reasons that I went into teaching was because I never wanted a child to feel like I felt.
So that is a girl's point of view. Tell me more about what happens with a boy in this situation, an African-American boy.
Well, African-American boys, just like boys in general, are much more active in those early childhood years. So there's already a mismatch there between teachers' expectations for what is considered appropriate behaviors. Most teachers are very adept at reinforcing female behaviors in those early childhood grade. Sit still, be quiet, be prim and proper. And the boys are moving around, and they want to be active, they want to be engaged, but the way that the teachers have been trained has reinforced supporting what girls do in the classroom. So when you add race into that, it just makes the situation that much more intense.
Rosemarie, there is training that teachers can get to try and attack this implicit bias. What's an example of how you help somebody see where they are being unconsciously different with one race or the other?
One of the things I do in my role as professor at Metro State University is I give a lecture on bias, on implicit bias. And that same day, I have all of my students get on the Metro rail and we go down to 5 points. And one of the things they have to do is recognize their bias when they pop up. Now, I would say about 85% of my students have never gone to 5 points, and they've heard about 5 points. They've heard that it's a very, very dangerous place to go. I've had students cry. I've had students say they didn't want to go. I had one student say, but wait, I need my pepper spray. And they go down there and they realize that most of what they heard was not true. And they have to walk the neighborhood and they see the gentrification of 5 points. They notice the coffee shop where we meet is very nice. I had one student come in and say, oh my goodness, it's so nice here. And I said, are you recognizing a bias? And she said, no. And I was quiet. Then finally she said, do you see a bias? And I said, well, did you expect it to be nice? And she goes, oh my goodness, I didn't. I didn't, and I had already made up my mind I wouldn't eat here. So practical everyday experiences. They go to the Buddhist temple, they go to a black church, they feed the homeless, and they come face to face with some of their greatest fears, and they realize that it was not based on much of anything.
So when teachers say, I don't see color, I'm colorblind, is something that people will say, you feel as though you can't be colorblind.
And not only can't you, but you shouldn't be. Because when you say you don't see color, you don't see me. You don't see black children, and you don't see all of the issues that come with being black in America. And not only that, our studies on implicit bias shows that those of us who rely on our egalitarian values, that we're more vulnerable to engaging in implicit bias because there's no trigger for us to really look deeply and look at ourselves.
Hakim, before we end, I would like to know about some of the solutions that you address in your film. What's going on out there that gives you hope that this can be overcome?
Well, one of the things we talk about is community-based organizations and what they can do. There's a heavy emphasis on some of the mentoring programs that are going on, things like the Children's Defense Fund, Freedom Schools, for example. We talk a lot about the role of parents, what parents have to do to stay engaged and involved with their children's education. And we also talk about some of the reform that needs to take place in teacher education. So those are probably 3 areas that we hit the most. And prior to doing that, though, we've got a lot of emphasis on the understanding the historical context. You can't really look at this situation of young black boys in America without really looking at the history of the relationship between black men in America and American culture.
Thank you both so much. Dr. Hakim Rashid is the writer and producer of the film Strange Fruit Redux, The Perils of Early Childhood Education for Young Black Boys, and Dr. Rosemarie Allen is professor of early childhood education at Metro State University. That's Colorado State of Mind for this week. Next week, join us for a special presentation from our partners at 9 News, a debate with the full field of Colorado Republican candidates for U.S. Senate. That's next week. Please join us then. I'm Cynthia Hessen. Good night.